Lumeta. Today we're going to have a webcast on the 5 steps to network situational awareness. Joining us today is our partner Booz Allen Hamilton. So let me just get the webinar started, so bear with me, folks. There we go. All right. So 5 steps to network situational awareness. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. If you have any questions during the course of the webinar, please feel free to put them in the question dialog box, and we'll get to answer those questions at the end of the webinar. If we do not get to answer your question during the webinar, we will be following up with you via email over the next couple of days. So today's speakers, we have Reggie Best, who is Lumeta's Chief Product Officer. Reggie is like I said, Lumeta's Chief Product Officer and has a product and technology background with more than 25 years of experience in communications, networking, and IT security. We have Ernie Anderson from Booz Allen. Ernie is a senior associate and has over 14 years of experience in information technology and has established himself as an information security expert across several industry in both private and public sectors. And we also have Steve Coraggio. Steve is also a senior associate with Booz Allen and has over 15 years of cybersecurity experience. So at that point, I'd like to throw this over to Reggie and enjoy the webinar, folks.
Thanks, Danny. My name is Reggie Best, and as Danny mentioned, I'm the Chief Product Officer here at Lumeta. While it may seem surprising, pretty much every enterprise customer engagement that we're involved with, there's a gap in understanding of the true nature of the organization's network infrastructure. And it doesn't matter whether it's our average customer in an enterprise deployment of about 150,000 IP addresses to a department with less than 10,000 IP addresses, or a federal government agency with over 1 million IPs. The results are generally about the same. There's a 10 to 20% gap in fundamental knowledge of the network infrastructure. That gap is often caused by the constant moves, changes, rearrangements of the network to address business needs. For example, one of our manufacturing customers, it's not uncommon for them to have more than 1,000 network changes or more every month. You're also having an issue with manual network change processes. There are human errors, there are oversights, there are temporary changes to the network infrastructure that don't get reversed. There's M&A and so forth. This lack of a complete, up-to-date understanding of the network infrastructure causes several potential vulnerabilities, including some of the ones that we list here. Unknown address space and use, for example, means that device vulnerability assessment tools or patch management tools are not reaching those devices that they simply don't know about. Not understanding the edge of the managed network infrastructure means that there could be paths to other networks, partner networks, extranets, or to the internet that are exposed to undesirable connections or rogue connections over which there could potentially be an exfiltration of corporate data. Self-signed or expired SSL certificates that remain in place, expose the web applications to potential for attack. Lumeta calls this understanding that fills the gap in network visibility, network situational awareness. And there are actually 3 phases to network situational awareness: discover, comprehend, and predict. The discover phase for the Lumeta offerings involves actually crawling the network infrastructure, listening to, interrogating the network devices themselves. These are the routers, the switches, the gateways, the firewalls, to see what is actually known and what is actually going on in real time on that infrastructure. That analysis and discovery can be done on a periodic basis. It can be done on demand. But increasingly, because of the pervasiveness of mobile and virtual and cloud network infrastructures, this may need to be continuously performed with analytics in near real time. Comprehend means making sense of all that information that has been discovered. The ability to visualize a map of the network or network zones of interest, indicating what devices are attached to what, to be able to drill in to see what routes exist between various points, to determine possible paths that could pose a threat to critical assets, plus the ability to score for tracking and trending. These are all things that fit into the comprehension bucket. The key here is the ability to comprehend and help the organization comprehend a priority of the most important things to focus on from a network situational awareness perspective. And last, but certainly not least, the ability to predict and remediate where issues may occur and help organizations fix those issues before they become critical is a key in providing complete network situational awareness. Over the course of several engagements that we've had over the years with our Lumeta offerings, we've developed a 5-step program to achieving network situational awareness. And this is a program that we work with our partners, such as Booz to implement as they go in with engagements, and also directly with our customers. Let me just walk through what those 5 steps are and give them a little bit of color. Step 1 in any engagement for network situational awareness is not assuming that you know what the address space in use is. This is a critical flaw of most vulnerability assessment and vulnerability management programs. Usually, there's a spreadsheet that someone's maintaining, or there could be an IP address management tool, or there could be a device vulnerability assessment tool. That's the starting point for understanding the address space in use. But routinely, when we actually implement step 1 and validating that address space by the crawling activity, the passive listening activity that we implement on network infrastructure, we routinely find significant areas of the network that have not previously been visible, that the organization doesn't know is there. So validating the address space and coming up with an accurate sense of the address space that's really in use is a critical first step in any engagement leading towards network situational awareness. Step 2, you have to understand where's the edge of the infrastructure. What's the stuff that I'm supposed to be taking care of and managing versus the stuff that's outside of my organizational boundary. And while this can be difficult and the edge can be very amorphous nowadays, it's still a very critical step to understand, where are the gateways to the internet? Where are the gateways to other partner extranets or other partner networks that I may be doing business with versus the part of the infrastructure that I'm most concerned with in terms of managing. You have to define the boundary in step 2 of the network that I am taking responsibility for and where I'm going to need to do a deeper dive assessment on all of those devices. Once you've completed steps 1 and 2, you then have step 3, which is conducting a census of all of the devices that are on that network infrastructure. You may not, in this particular phase, know what the device is, but you are going to use various techniques in the Lumeta offerings to know without any hesitation or with any gap that there is indeed a device there. You will be looking for and detecting printers. You'll be detecting wireless access points in industrial devices, regular servers, mobile devices, and so forth. So the conducting of an endpoint census at step 3 is critical to understand the presence of all of the hosts that we call them on the network infrastructure. In step 4, once you've gotten a sense of the boundaries of the network, the address space in use, the fact that there are end devices that are there, you can then drill in and do a deeper dive assessment of all the endpoints on that infrastructure. Most of device vulnerability assessment tools in the marketplace start with item number 4, and they've missed all of the baselining capabilities that come before it in the Lumeta 5-step program. But in that step 4, that's where you're going to get more details on the particular device. What operating system is it running? What kind of hardware release level is it? Is it a phone? Is it a printer? Is it a computer? Is it a Mac? Is it a PC? Is it a server? What kind of operating system is it running? And so forth. And this helps in terms of providing the organization assistance with asset management in particular. Last but not least, step 5, based on all of the other information that you've gathered, you're going to help here to identify potential network vulnerabilities. And I'm going to talk a little bit on the next slide about some actual implementations and some of the network vulnerabilities that we've identified for customers. But that, in particular, is useful information that can then be fed back into other security devices, IP address management platforms, network change and configuration management platforms, so that those devices can also then do a better job of helping the organization protect their network infrastructure. So the classes of problems that we identified is illustrated here. I'm not going to run through all of them, but we identify certainly on the network infrastructure perspective issues with the routed devices, the routers, the switches. Are they accessible in a secure way or not? Unknown devices, non-responding networks, ports that may be vulnerable that you thought were closed, but that through our analytics we're detecting or not. Expired and self-signed certificates, unauthorized forwarding devices that development team, for example, may have implemented, or you may have put in temporarily for access to a particular partner, but it was never taken out in terms of the remediation or reversing that change. So looking at a handful of customers and the kinds of things that we define and mapping them, this is a summary, a picture of those sorts of things. Let's take the last column where the company is in the high technology space. I mean, their assumption from information that we pulled out of an IP address management tool was that they had 100,000 IP addresses in their organization. After implementing our 5-step program, we found 14,000 more addresses actually in use on their infrastructure that they believed were there. That meant that those 14,000 IP addresses were not being appropriately managed by existing device vulnerability management tools. It was not knowledge that was available to the IP address management system, and therefore that was a huge gap in knowledge of the actual extent of the network infrastructure. Those devices were spread around 433 unknown networks. These were actual networks in use inside the organization that were not known to any of the automated management tools in existence. And this is very common. Devices, 2,000 unauthorized network devices. Most of those were wireless access points. Someone popped up and said, hey, I'd like a wireless access point so I can gain access to the network infrastructure. Gee, let me go put one in so it's closer to my office. These are the kinds of things that certainly from a security and for a network operations perspective you're gonna want to know about. And you can see they were particularly alarmed in that particular case at the number of self-signed and expired SSL certificates that were implemented on web application tools and other infrastructure in their corporate intranet. So this was all identified despite the fact that there were other device vulnerability management tools in place within the organization. And in fact, the output of the analytics that our Lumeta 5-step program provided actually helped those devices do a better job in subsequent iterations of managing the network infrastructure. So I'd like to turn the conversation over to Stephen and Ernie, our partner from Booz and Hamilton, who have actually used the Lumeta 5-step process in their data protection engagements, to give a little bit more of a drill down on how that's worked for them and some of the benefits that they've been able to achieve for their customers.
Okay. Thank you, Reggie. This is Steve Coraggio. I'm a senior associate at Booz Allen out of our New York office. I co-lead our data protection capabilities in the commercial space. I also lead our asset management capability. I've had the privilege of working on multiple Lumeta engagements with multiple clients that have very complex environments. And one of the things that we're going to talk about in the next 15 to 20 minutes is how Booz Allen can support the technology, the successful deployment of the technology, and how we can wrap our services around enhancing the output and enhancing the recommendations that come with this technology. So I'm also joined by Ernie Anderson, who's the other co-lead for data protection.
Yeah, and as Steve mentioned, Ernie Anderson, I'm a senior associate out of the San Diego office. I've been in IT for about 14 years, 12 years with consulting, and 10 years of that with Booz Allen. I co-lead data protection on the West Coast, and as well as vulnerability management. And one of the things we've been trying to do is, Steve and I have been trying to find the ultimate package of how do you build out your program as far as data protection and vulnerability management is concerned across people, process, and technology. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the technology aspect, given our nature with Lumeta here. But briefly, when we go into projects, a lot of the times in vulnerability management, for example, it's based on what our clients are giving us. So they'll say, okay, we have a bunch of servers that are in this one enclave and in this subnet. Ernie, I want you to take a team in here, go test that, find out what the vulnerabilities are, and figure out how do we remediate them. So we go in, we've got host ranges based on what they've told us, we do the testing, we come out with great reports, and we fix those. We've always delivered exceptionally well, toot my own horn in that space, but then we start challenging, well, what is the foundational aspects of how we got there? So really, how are they coming up with the information that they're providing us, saying that these are actually the most critical servers that we need to look at? Or if we're looking in data protection, same thing. How have we inventoried all the systems that are out there? Do we know what the most critical, valuable ones are? And then we're actually feeding that into our data protection programs. We're doing the associated DLP scanning, and you name it. So we started looking around, again, back to our Uber ecosystem, if you will, of perfect tools, trying to find a solution that would help us do that discovery aspect and basically feed all these different control families within your security program. Again, there's stuff like Nmap or even like a Qualys or a Nessus. They can tell you a lot of information about what's on your network, but again, it's based on the feeds that you give us. So these are the known subnets that we know about. The real question is, what don't you know about? And that's how we end up stumbling onto Lumeta. I actually really like these guys because they can do that dynamic discovery of networks, crawling through your network infrastructure using SNMP to discover those networks that you don't know about. Frankly, if we're going to find something that's unprotected or vulnerable, or maybe information we don't know about, I think there's a good chance it could be in those networks that we previously haven't been protecting. So we've actually done a bunch of projects where we've now packaged in Lumeta to do some of those discovery aspects. And typically when we match what we see being scanned in vulnerability scanners versus what we discovered, there's almost always a gap. Ties into what Reggie talked about earlier, that there's a certain assumption on how many IPs are out there, and we always find a lot more than what we're accounting for, almost every time. So again, talking the slide a little bit more, there's a foundational aspect within network situational awareness that really feeds a lot of your security operations and is foundational to your program.
So the next slide here, this slide will talk about how we wrap our professional services around the tool itself. We want to talk about the value of having a defined process and framework to support the implementation of this technology and to gain the full potential of the actual scans. So as Ernie mentioned, Reggie spoke earlier about the tactical scan requirements for the actual deployment of the scans. But what most organizations fail to realize is that pre-work and post-analytics is necessary for a successful network awareness engagement. So as we mentioned, we've done multiple deployments in very complex environments, and what we've realized is that there's a lot of pre-work that's required to understanding, taking a look at what is what do you think your environment looks like, what do you think is active in your environment, and then taking a look at the output from the Lumeta tool to analyze it and provide detailed recommendations based on the output findings. So as we walk through the steps, let's talk about all three of these stages. So the first stage that we would do with an engagement is to take a look at your current IP address management program. Within this stage, we'll review and document known IP management space. We'll also build a scorecard to help track IP space, we also want to document who owns and manages your known IPs and who is responsible for using this output and how it is actually used. We'll also create a rules of engagement document that outlines things such as scanning times, do not scan ranges, and emergency points of contact. So based on known IP space and scorecard, we'll architect and actually deploy the Lumeta sensors for the most efficient and effective scanning. So that's really our pre-work. That's the evaluate stage.
And if I could just add, so we've seen with different clients, the IP address management system varies all over the place for maturity. The other thing that we're seeing is, there's a big trend with offshoring, actually using third-party vendors to manage your networks. So it's really not trivial in some cases. You may have one vendor that manages, a certain region, a completely different vendor that manages another region that uses a different IPAM system. Some could be using spreadsheets. Some could be using, QIP. So in some cases, it can be trivial. It could be, everything's in one spot and it's easy to pull that information. Other cases, it can take a lot of interviewing, a lot of discovery, a lot of reviewing the change management processes to figure out how those different things are being fed into those inventories. So this level of effort can vary all over the place, and we've seen everything in projects we've done. So sorry.
Yeah, thanks. I think the more efficient and diligent you are with evaluating your current environment, understanding who owns the IPs, who do you think owns the IPs, and how those IPs are used, the more effective and efficient the actual scan results will be. So the upfront effort could vary, like Ernie said, between a few weeks to a few months. It depends on the environment and how well you know your own environment. So when we talk about the deploy, those are the 5 steps that Reggie mentioned earlier. Here you're going to validate your network IP space. You're going to run the scans. You're going to validate the network edge. You're going to identify vulnerabilities. You're even going to identify what devices are connected to your network. So this is the tactical scanning with the IP sonar tool.
And one thing we probably want to highlight too is the 5 steps that Reggie laid out. They build on top of each other. So typically, you don't want to go right into the point where you're doing leak detection. You want to spend the time figuring out that breadth. Where is my network before you dive into saying what are all the devices on there. So we've seen clients that have jumped around to different pieces, and ultimately you end up having to go back to step 1 and work through the whole process again. So it's something that's been tried a bunch of times over the years. It's really been refined that this is a good approach for actually performing these scanning activities.
Yep. So the last stage is actually taking a look at the scan output, right? So what we want to do is decipher the result, analyze it, provide meaningful and tactical recommendations based on what the tool is telling us. So here we'll take the output, we'll compare them versus what you have in CMDB, what are you feeding your vulnerability management tools, and how you're actually using your IP space. So it's a matter of deciphering the output, taking a look at it, and creating actionable tactical recommendations. So again, just like any technology, I think the output needs to be analyzed for value, and the technology usually requires configuration and then rescan. So part of the value here is taking a look at quote-unquote false positives. What are we seeing that we don't need to see? How do we reconfigure the tool? Where do we maybe we have to move some sensors around to put them in places that are more, there's more heavy traffic, and just rescanning that. So that's part of the iterative process with this tool, is defining it, refining it, and creating more meaningful output.
Yeah, I think one other thing that Steve has here on the recommendation pieces is that the key here is that when we find gaps in IP address management systems or devices that we didn't know about, those are usually symptomatic indicators of programmatic problems. So there's some type of process breakdown that's happening in configuration management where someone's not feeding back to IPAM. We're adding a network that's not feeding to vulnerability management. There's something that's happening at a higher programmatic level that you need to tie and find that root cause analysis to really make sure you're fixing it, hopefully so when you go back and you do rescans that you're not finding as big of a problem. It's now just audit to make sure everything is done correctly. So if it's a project we're running, it's nice for us to go ahead and go on the scanner. The tool is great. It's easy to run. I think a lot of times we provide that value by looking at those systemic issues. But even if we're not doing a project for you, we would recommend that you guys do that internally if you're actually doing scans to fix the programmatic problem versus just resolving the couple findings you have and then moving on and waiting till 3 years from down the road when you do another scan.
Yep. So the next few slides we're going to talk about an actual case study. So one of the engagements that we recently completed, we'll talk a little bit about the situation and background, why we were brought in to support this Lumeta tool, what were the objectives, so what did the client lay out for us in terms of what they want to accomplish with this tool, and then we'll talk about some of the recommendations, some of the systematic issues that Ernie mentioned, of how we can improve their process with looking above and beyond just the tool itself.
Yeah, so the case study we laid out for you, obviously we try to keep our clients confidential, so we've genericized as much as we can, but try to leave it enough so it'll be impactful and resonate with the people that we have on the line. So the case study we've laid out is for a major pharmaceutical company with a global presence. They have, similar to we mentioned before with the IP address management systems, they have multiple vendors that are managing the attached devices to the network. Configuration management is done by different vendors as well. And like any big company now, we're seeing a lot of M&A activity. So they're either buying certain companies and merging them into their network. Frankly, they have partner networks now where we're more relying on sharing information back and forth fairly freely. And there's divestitures where they've had certain divisions which they've sold off. Point being is we need a good touch point where we can figure out where the network actually is and validate our assumptions on where we think the network is. The other thing that we're seeing, and this actually ties more into the data protection side that Steve and I chase or help our clients with, is the trend to move overseas. And then sometimes, well, let's just be frank, working in China, worrying about your intellectual property going over there and protecting it. So again, it's making sure that we have those boundaries in place to protect data from going there, that we don't have open feeds to areas that we think would be more sensitive or we're concerned about getting in our network. So that was a concern. And there's always an increased number of applications that people have on the network. I mean, devices are just expanding. We've got BYOD. The number of devices getting plugged in just keeps increasing, and when we want a solid inventory and know, frankly, what devices are actually being plugged in, certain profiles.
So the objectives were simple. It kind of ties right to the situation in the background. This client wanted to understand what are their active spaces, what's their active managed active hosts and networks. They wanted to understand what devices were connected to their network, what was live, and they also wanted to understand if there was any leaks. So what could we run from a leak detection perspective? The other thing they also wanted to know was what devices were connected. So what devices did they think they were connected to their network versus what are unknown devices that are now active on their network?
Yeah, and with this particular client, we branched out a little bit further than just the traditional discovery piece, network situational awareness, where we wanted to do some of those interviews. We know that there's almost always going to be a feed into vulnerability management at the very least, so we wanted to reach out and just kind of see what those feeds were. Programmatically, how can we feed the results that we have to benefit those other control families, vulnerability management, down the future. So we wanted to make sure that our results were actionable and beneficial for different areas of the security program. Again, this is a collection of results that we typically see from this profile of use case. And we just wanted to walk through, like, what are actually some of the results that we saw and deficiencies that we noted, and then some of the actionable recommendations that came out of it. Not surprisingly, one of the first ones was when we looked at the IT asset management inventory. We found that when we actually did the scans and we tried to resolve what are the subnets that we found, add labels, that we couldn't easily identify. We couldn't work with the vendors to figure out, okay, which subnet is this? Where is it located? Who's in charge of it? We're finding, too, that the ability to gather that information, the inventory information, was slowing down other security functions. So, for example, vulnerability management, your Qualys scans weren't being updated as the networks were being updated. So there could be a 6-month gap where we're missing coverage. So one of the things that we recommended there was that we, number one, we go ahead and we go through the IP address management systems and we evaluate them. how well are they doing? Steve had mentioned earlier the idea of a scorecard. So go ahead, score the different vendors that are managing these spaces, and see how accurate their current listing is versus what we found. And then the other one is actually, purely tactfully, we need to go back and update the address management system so they're up to date with what we found. We talked again, I keep hinting on vulnerability management because it's something near and dear to my heart, but when we did the comparison of what we found for subnets, we actually looked at their vulnerability scanning system, and we looked at a delta. And of course, we found that there was a significant gap of areas that we were missing. So our recommendation was obviously to go through and review the results that we had from Lumeta and feed it into the scanner so we had full coverage moving forward.
Yeah, and vice versa. There were things in their vulnerability management scanner that were not found on the IP sonar scans. So we wanted to figure out, what are they scanning? Maybe it's not theirs. We assumed it's not theirs. So go back and do I guess, negative use case and figure out, why are they scanning things that are not active on their environment?
Yeah.
So.
And again, so we talked about trying to tie into how do we improve the overall program. So one of the things that we looked at here as well, and when we talk about the application of risk management framework, is now we've gone out and we've actually identified all these different types of devices. So we know that there's critical database servers. We know that there's SharePoint servers, maybe even process control network servers. There's a certain level of valuation to those systems. So we can't treat everything the same. So if we run vulnerability scans and we find hides across, I don't know, servers versus workstations, I would think the servers would need to be addressed sooner than something that's a lonely workstation, or accessibility. So what we did here is we said, look, we now have this really good information. We need to go ahead and have someone go and review these systems, figure out what the valuations are, implement something like an EGRC tool so you can consume the information from IP Sonar, you can add the valuations. Now you can feed things like data protection, vulnerability management based on a risk management framework and prioritize your efforts. And then the final one is, again, we talked about always trying to get to the root cause analysis. What is the systemic issue? And a lot of it, I think, just came back to configuration management type issues. Do we have defined processes when we make these changes to make those feedback loops to the IP address management system? Do we have those feedback loops to go back and tell your vulnerability scanners to update? So one of the things we had here was we found that there were symptomatic issues of process breakdowns, and a lot of times it's configuration management that would need a deep dive review later to make sure those hooks are in there. And we can refine them, do process improvement to know that there's ongoing systemic issues that will address some of the breakdowns that we identified through our scans.
All right, great, Ernie and Steve. Thank you very much. That was very, very informative on your use case and your experience in the field. At this point, I'd like to basically invite people to ask questions via the Q&A dialog box in your GoToWebinar screen. And while you're doing that, I'll get started with some questions we already have in the queue. The first question is for Reggie about what kinds of costs are involved in the Lumeta software offerings.
The Lumeta software offerings are relatively inexpensive and straightforward for an organization to obtain and to implement. We've got a flexible pricing model that's based on number of IP addresses under management within the infrastructure. We can start with as few as 1,000 IP addresses in a department of a smaller organization or a department of even a large organization, up to millions of IP addresses under management. And the solution is available as a subscription, oriented model, software as a service, for cloud type implementations, or in a more traditional perpetual plus maintenance kind of a model. So a network with our average about 150,000 IP addresses is going to be, in the neighborhood, not including, our partners' professional services, of course, just the tool itself. It's probably going to be in the neighborhood of, $100,000, kind of annually. On a perpetual basis, you're probably looking at a couple $100,000, in a perpetual plus maintenance kind of a model.
Okay, great. Thank you, Reg. I believe this question is probably for Ernie or Steve or both. What is the biggest challenge that organizations face when deploying this technology?
Yeah, thanks. Good question. So I think here it comes down to the 3 stages that I mentioned earlier. It's about the pre-work. So most organizations don't understand their current IP space, what's active in their environment, who manages their IPs. So getting a good grasp on what you think your environment looks like, where are the boundaries, what devices do you think you have prior to scanning, I think is key. The other biggest challenge that organizations face is purchasing this tool and not knowing what to do with the output, the results. So the tool is very powerful. It provides very meaningful and detailed results, but it's a matter of how do we take those results and create them into actionable and tactical recommendations. So deciding how to use the output, how do you feed certain technology tools, security tools like vulnerability management, like Ernie mentioned, CMDB. How do you take this output and really create meaningful results for other areas of your environment? And that's where we find the most gaps.
Okay, great. Thanks, Steve. Yep. I think this one is for Reggie. Can the Lumeta tool be used to provide network situational awareness on virtual network environments or the cloud?
Yeah, absolutely. Another big area where we're seeing many of our customers migrating towards private cloud or hybrid cloud kinds of environments, away from the purely physical network infrastructures that we've historically seen. And yes, the Lumeta offerings for network situational awareness are available as virtual machine instances. They can provide visibility of both private and public, or a combination or hybrid cloud kinds of environments, which we're finding is increasingly important as enterprises migrate to those kinds of architectures in their data center.
Great, thanks, Reg. This one's for Booz Allen. What are the top security control families that you see this product feeding?
Well, this is kind of an easy one. This is Ernie. I think the top one is always vulnerability management, right? So we want to feed and make sure we have that whole situational awareness that's feeding in the vulnerability scanner, which gives you those vulnerability information. I think the runner-up to those two would be around, frankly, your CMDBs and your IT address management systems. It would pull those out there and update them. And then the third would be data protection. Outside of that, we've actually seen people using this in an audit capacity for, we talked about certificates, is finding those expired certificates and self-signed certificates as well.
Okay. Ernie, I think this actually is a follow-up question to that question you just answered. What is the average duration of professional services deployment using Lumeta?
That's a good question. I will try to simplify. I think typically we're looking from anywhere between 12 to 16 weeks. And a lot of that is around things that Steve talked about, the professional services aspect. The tool itself is fairly straightforward to deploy, and the scans are very lightweight. So anybody out there who's done things like DLP discovery scans or vulnerability management scanning knows if you're trying to go through a Class A network, it'll take forever using Nessus or Qualys, something like that. The tool itself is very quick, being able to get through Class A's in a matter of days. So a lot of the times it's the business analytics that goes into it, saying, how do we compare these results? How do we come up with recommendations that adds to that time and gets you to that 12 to 16 weeks?
Great, thanks, Ernie. We have time for one more. Actually, this one's for Reggie. What kind of training can Lumeta provide if we want to operationalize the 5-step process?
Lumeta has pretty much canned training programs that are available to help our partners and customers in terms of implementing the 5-step process. Because our folks internally, our support teams, have been doing this and have developed this actually over a number of years. We have a book that we use to actually train, show other organizations such as, Booz Allen, here's how you do it. Here's how things we learned. Here's how to actually implement the 5-step process, the kinds of questions and how to plug those responses into the necessary scan configurations that are required to get our product to do this stuff. So routinely, a couple days of training as a starting point, and then sort of follow on as you get, the hands-on is the essential model that we utilize to get our partners and user customers up to speed on the platform itself.
Great, thanks, Reg. I appreciate everybody's time this afternoon. If you have any questions that we're not able to get to during the webinar today, we'll be sure to follow up with you over the next couple of days. This will also be available online, and you'll be getting notified when this webinar will be available via email. So again, I'd like to thank everybody for their time today, and have a great rest of your day.